Thank you very much. Yeah, but let's start. We are very happy that we are allowed to come here today and talk about our angle into software development. We are not software developers. We can break it to you already. So we do not code. We do not do all the technical parts, but we know a lot about human beings and human behavior, and that's what we want to talk about today. So. First of all, we want to ask this question, and this is what we usually ask ourselves every single day, is what is security? What is secure? For a lot of you guys here, I can probably imagine that security is about encryption, codes, security by design, and so on. But we are asking ourselves the question of who is the person who actually tells you what secure is? For developers, it's usually the people who are doing the products or the services, but we are looking at the human being or the customer or the user. What do they see as something being secure? How do they feel secure? What is the feeling of secure? And how can we test that in a proper way in order for everyone to be happy? Sorry. So yeah, as mentioned before, my name is Anja. I'm an ethnographer. I will get back to what that is in just a second. My main goal is to make technology work for humans and vice versa in order to have a better world in the future and have new and emerging technologies work for human beings in the best possible way. On a daily basis, I actually work with cybersecurity, so I understand a lot about coding and security by design and software development, but I actually work with this thing called social engineering, which is the way that people are actually hacking human beings in order to get their data and so on. And I'm currently in the works to become a data protection officer, so I have a lot of understanding for the GDPR as well. I am an ethnographer by education, so I actually study the human behavior in everyday life. So how do we work? What kind of processes do we have in everyday life? How do we work at work? How do we work at home? And so on. In old times, I think people would imagine an ethnographer being someone who lives with indigenous people, with tribes, and understanding how they have rituals and parties and rites of passage and so on. But I work at that in a commercial setting, in a real-world setup. And Sarah is a user experience designer, and she likes to work with making sure digital products and services meet the users' needs and capabilities. And on a daily basis, she works in DBI, as we call it, in a daily basis, with prototypes, mock-ups, and so on. As that was mentioned before, we actually work with in the Danish Institute of Fire and Security Technology, which are specialized in security regarding fire and lives and properties. We started as being part of the Copenhagen Fire Brigade 150 years ago. So we are a very old company in the eyes of Denmark. And then we went into a private company where we are actually supporting industries and small and medium-sized enterprises in ensuring that they are secure in both fire and cyber. Our main aim is to secure lives and values. We work with physical security, as I mentioned, so we work with ensuring perimeters, that a building doesn't burn down and so on, and then of course in cybersecurity, because more and more values has become digital, especially regarding the GDPR, so a lot of data, personal data, we want to protect that for both our customers but also ordinary people. So we talk about terrors and tornadoes. So terror is what we talk about is in like the intentional, so someone hacking you or someone breaking into your building or actually setting fire to a building. It's an intentional liability. And then we have tornadoes, which is mostly like force majeure, so accidentally leaking data, accidentally setting something on fire, and so on. So we are actually working with this holistic aspect of a building industry and security industry. So we want to look at the facility manager, the IT guy, the employees, the management, and so on. So we actually look at the whole aspect of a whole organization instead of only looking at specific parts of an organization. So this is what we usually do in our everyday lives.
Yes. So for our next part, we're looking a bit at the users and why do we develop products. So this product here is called the egg miner. So this very useful product is telling you if you have any eggs left in this little app here. And my question is just, this may be a smart product, but who's it for and why? Who needs it? So I think that's a very important question to ask yourself once you're developing something. Why should we do this? Who should be the user and what should be their use case? When do you need to know you need X? And do you need it all the time? So another part you can look at is something user-friendly. So for example here, you can look at different types of design. So for this elevator, it might be a bit confusing on which floor am I actually going to. I don't know what the intention was here, but I would get really confused. So the next part here is this carpet, and I don't know why the designer thought that was a good idea, but it could be a bit confusing on, I guess you shouldn't be drunk when you're going down the stairs. And here we're looking a bit like, okay, so we have this, design that we're always doing because this is our product, but you didn't really take into account that users can buy both products, and it might make a huge deal for them whether they're using fly and insect killer or they're using a cooking spray. So looking at what is the use case is actually a big part of developing a product or a service. So I'm a UX designer, and we have this fine graph that shows us this is all the different things that I have to take into account when I'm part of a project. So I have to look at what's the content, how do we design it so that the user can understand what they're trying to find, and how can we make this interesting for them and as easy as possible to use, and how do we actually find out what their main goal is? Why are they going to our website? Is it because we want them to, or is it because it's something completely different? So we're trying to look at very different aspects of it. And a huge part of my job is actually also looking at behind everything, the architecture. How do we build up a website or an app, and how do we make sure that people actually understand how things are linked together and can find the things that they need in the shortest path possible? So now you're getting a very classical UX example. So this is the product design versus experience design. So we have a classical product design, for example, ketchup. So we're making this new fancy ketchup with, I don't know, something, fish in it, whatever. And then, so I'm tasked with making a new design. So I'll say, okay, product design, I'll just make a new label because this is what a ketchup is supposed to look like. But if I look at it like an experience designer, I would look at, okay, so what type of issues do users actually have with this type of design? Well, it's kind of annoying that once you're trying to get the last piece out, that it won't really come out, and it's actually a bit annoying because when it's filled, there's too much and it gets everywhere, and it's actually kind of annoying. So if we try and turn the bottle around and say, okay, so this is actually made for the experience that we want people to have, because this way it actually fits the way that people use it, then we're looking at the experience instead of just the product. So that will be user experience design. So when we're looking at users, okay, so who are they? It's an empty blanket. We can do whatever. So who are we actually designing for? This might not be very useful in a situation where you're actually trying to get out or I don't know, fight a fire or something. I mean, I don't think you can get into that, or you need a key to actually start the fire alarm here. I don't know how many people actually have keys where they're going, but that could be a bit insecure. So now you're getting another classical UX example. You've probably seen it before, where we're looking at, this is the intended design, and this is the user experience. Okay, so we can look at this picture in a number of different ways. We can say, okay, people are just malicious. They're looking at different ways to misuse our product. They are destroying it. Or we could take another example and say, okay, this is just plain stupid. I mean, why would you build a fence there? There are no other fences. Why? Why would you make it so complicated to be walking here? So if we take those glasses and look at this picture again and say, okay, where is this guy actually going? Oh, up there, there's a bridge. Why is the path leading him away from the bridge? Maybe there's an overarching design that we don't know, but looking at this picture, we can also say, okay, why did they make grass here? If they don't want people to walk here, the easiest way to get to the bridge, why didn't they make bushes or put a fence or something like that? Why are they making it so easy for us to go another path but not make it intended? So maybe we should look at where people are actually trying to go and how do we make it as easy as possible for them. So another part of my job is actually to make mock-up or visualizations and look at, okay, how do we make sure that we're actually talking about the same thing? So this is an illustration that I thought was pretty good, where we have 3 different people and say, okay, glad we all agree, but we're actually thinking about 3 very different things. So once we actually draw them and get a visualization of what we're actually thinking, then we can start and get some real feedback and talk to each other or to users about what we want or what we need. And that's once we actually start and be co-creative and start making ideas together instead of just having our own little vision. So then we can actually all agree on the same thing. Still, there can be different things that varies, but once you have something on paper, it's a lot easier to present it to someone that's not a part of your specific thought process or the way that you exactly think. Yeah.
So we have been asked the question a lot of times, so is UX design and ethnography not basically the same thing? Because you both do user insight research, you ask the same questions and so on. And yeah, it overlaps a lot. The whole idea with ethnography is to understand the whole setting that's in. So Sarah, it's actually, as you mentioned before, looking into where is the user heading, and I'm actually looking at where is the user coming from. So what is the background, what is the idea, what is the setting, how is the policies in the company, how do they work with different departments, the whole holistic approach to a company. You can't just change one little bolt and then expect everything to cascade into something big and amazing. You have to look into what this little bolt actually does to the whole system. So actually trying to look at the causes of how you change this stuff. So how do we actually apply this in a real setting, in the real world, for inspiration? How do we do it in DBI where we work? So we are part of these different phases in projects in DBI. One project that Sarah is about to talk about in just a minute. So we are actually part of the pre-projects. So we set up the hypothesis about, okay, what do we want to change? What do we want to solve? What kind of issue do the customer, the company, the user have? And how is this changed, or how is this solution made? So we do interviews and field work prior to actually starting the project, actually trying to set the scene. And we do that in co-relations with the people who are actually the project leaders and also the developers to figure out what is actually possible. Then we are part of the project startup, so we still have hypotheses of how we should do stuff. We have interviews, we do fieldwork and question guides in order to figure out what is exactly the good thing to do. Which way should we actually work towards? What is possible in the technology we have today, the money, the whole setting, and what's not possible. During projects, we actually, when we approach let's say, a solution that's interchangeable and tangible, we actually test that. So we do field work and focus groups with our customers and our users and actually test the wireframes, the mock-ups to figure out, are we in the right direction? And that's the data that we come in and analyze as UX designers and ethnographers and actually give that to our software developers and the people who are developing the apps or the services and tell them, this is what our customers are saying, this is not working for them, this is working for them, they would like more of this and this and this, and we can actually work in a correlation to build a better service or a better app. Then at the end of the project, we are also doing fieldwork and wireframes to adapt the last changes. And if we have done all the different steps correctly, the post-project and implementation phase and the review phase is actually quite simple, because if you've done your work prior, implementing a new app or a new service is actually pretty easy. But if we figure out that, oh, we have only asked the facility manager, but we haven't asked the IT guy, then we have to ask the IT guy to figure out how do we implement that in his everyday work process. For example, emergency app or something like that. So this is the process, and then we just do that over and over and over again until we have the perfect solution.
Yes. So this is an example of the emergency cockpit, which is still a research project. So it's not a product yet or anything like that. It actually started as a research project where we wanted to try and look at the way that we train employees right now, the way that we make emergency planning. How can we make that more accessible for regular employees? So one of the things that we actually looked at was, how do people behave in an emergency situation? Well, there's a lot of different things to take into account. I mean, what is their background? That would be something that Anja would look at. Like, how do they actually react if you pull a fire alarm? Will they run out? Will they hesitate because it's probably a drill? Or how do things actually work? So our first part of my involvement in it was to interview a lot of security managers from different big corporations to talk about how do they actually train employees right now and how do they present the information that they have. And a lot of the things that we found was that training takes a huge amount of time, because if you want to make a full-scale evacuation drill, for example, then you have to pull every employee there is to get them out and place them in front of the building, for example. But that actually means that you lose a lot of production time. So for a production company where you can't turn the machines off, this is a no-go. You can't do that. And what's the actual benefit of just trying to get people to go out of building? They probably know the way they came in is probably also the way they're going to go out. So how do we look at training people to actually find the nearest emergency exits? Because that's probably a door they don't usually use. And how do we train people to use a fire extinguisher and actually minimize the damage that is being done to a building? How can we prevent a huge fire if we train the employees? So that was one of the things that we tried to look at and say, okay, we want to make these short training episodes that only takes about 5 to 10 minutes for a regular employee to complete, and they can do it like in a small break or something like that. So that's actually kind of where the idea came from. So the idea here is that you have an app on your phone that use augmented reality and pathfinding to place you in a building and then find the nearest emergency exit to where you're placed. And that way it will show you these kind of lines or arrows to where you're actually supposed to go. That way they can lead you safely out, and that would be the basic training. So you will find, oh, okay, where's the nearest fire extinguisher? How do I use it? All these type of information that you should probably know. And then the second part will be these short scenarios where you end up with a fire in a coffee machine. And you say, okay, so what should you do now? You're getting no help, no arrows, just an overlay of fire over the coffee machine that's already there. And say, okay, so what have you learned? How can you turn this off? Or how can you evacuate everybody? And what should you do? And that way you can train people in lots of different scenarios. That doesn't only have to be fire. It could also be a coworker just suddenly collapsed. Maybe you should figure out what's wrong with him or something. Call someone. Or maybe there's something about awareness training. Maybe you shouldn't open that email. Something like that. So actually, this way we can train a lot of people in a lot of different areas that could be interesting for both a security manager but also for a decision maker or something. So how do we do this? Well, you ask the people, what are you actually doing right now? So the way that we look at it is we look at the behavior on similar products. So the way that we did this here, where we talked about how do they do it now, well, how do they use it? Is it a physical exercise? Is it just sitting down and have an information meeting in 30 minutes every half a year? Or how do they do it now, and how can we optimize that process? So the way that I approached it was to talk to people that are doing something similar, but trying to optimize it or change it, and see how our app can actually work with it. So what we found was that there's a discrepancy between there's the user, which here will be the trainee, the regular employee, and then there's the security manager, who can both be a user because he will need an overview of what is his employees doing. Are they even training this? Should I put something else in it? So he would lead some sort of learning management system, actually, to keep track of where are these people going and should everything be as it is. And then we have a decision maker, the one that's actually paying for it, the customer. So how do we make sure that he understands that it's actually cheaper for him to train people using this product in short bursts of time instead of having this huge training session just once a year that doesn't really make any sense? So we also find that there's a big difference between what the security manager was, okay, we need to train everything that we need because we need to be as secure as possible. But you have a lot of employees that aren't really involved, and they're only just, sometimes there's a fire alarm and then we have to leave the building and nobody really understands why. So a part of this was actually to look at, okay, how can we make sure that they feel motivated and engaged? How can we make them feel like they're a part of making these security policies? And a way to do that was actually to say that, well, in this product, you can also give feedback to the security manager. You can say, oh, this store isn't actually working. There's something wrong with these security measures. So you get people, all your different employees, to actually help you investigate and make sure that your building is actually living up to the code that you say they do. And another part for it is that we found that employees that already have a lot of responsibilities for elders or kids like teachers and so actually are way more motivated to learn these different things for themselves because they're very aware of the responsibilities that they have for these people. So that's a huge part of the target that we are trying to hit. Yeah.
So some of the values that we actually give to these different projects, for example, as the one that Sarah just talked about, is that we have this third-party bird-eye view perspective. We're the bridging parties between the technology, the evacuations, the facility managers, and the guys that are actually developing this app. We're actually understanding, okay, how can we actually make this a safe environment to work in and ensure that production won't be halted because we have to do this drill each year because that's the law in Denmark. So how can we do this and actually not circumvent the law but fulfill the lawful purposes that we have? We have this insight in human needs and wants in technical as well as non-technical projects. So we understand, or we are, both me and Sarah, but also our other colleagues at DBI, have an understanding in different areas of both the human but also the technical. So it's within maritime, cybersecurity for me, evacuation, so on for Sarah. So we know how to do it. For example, usually we always tell people that having a long password on your phone or your computer is the best. 16 plus characters is the best when if you were attacked by a brute force. That was very important to have a long character password, but that doesn't really work in the real life because when people work in normal settings at a workplace, they can't remember 16 characters with the big and small letters and different dashes and so on. So they usually just use their dog's name or their birth date or something like that. So how can we marry those two? How can we marry the understanding of something being secure enough to secure your computer and your workplace, but also be easy enough to use it in an everyday basis? Because usually people, I've seen it because that's what I work with, people write the code on a Post-it and put it in their drawer. So it's not secure anymore. They actually just write it down. So we're trying to make people understand why are you securing this, why it's important to secure your computer and your data, but it's, for example, but also why, how can we make it easy for you? Because too much security can make it unusable, which means that you will have no security because people will circumvent the security on a day-to-day basis. So we actually also uncovering future needs both for DBI as well as the customers, our users and humans. So we're trying to look into the crystal ball to see, okay, so how can we work with this in the future? So some of the projects that we're actually working on, I'm actually working on, is cybersecurity and digital emergency planning. So from the learning of the project we have that Sarah is working on, we are actually developing a cybersecurity surveillance service that will surveil a critical infrastructural sector in Denmark and do emergency data let's say notification. So we will actually be able to see if someone is on their network, and if there is, the right people will be announced and notified to do the exact thing they should do. So, and cyber fire. So when a cyber alarm goes off, the exact person knows exactly what to do, what computer to shut off, what servers, and so on. So that's one of the projects that I'm working on currently. And we're also working in developing smart houses / commercial buildings. What does it mean for humans to live in a house or a building, or use a house or a building that's totally IoT based? So every single thing is an IoT device, the lights, the alarm system and so on, access control, and what does this data do? Like, how can we integrate fire security with IoT and the transfer of data? How does this live up to the GDPR, and what can we use this data for? Can we use it to optimize? Can it be hacked? Can we hack a building in the future? And what does it mean for the people who are actually living in the building? How would they feel that they're surveilled all the time? They know when you are and where you are, at what point and what time and space. There's some ethical issues about that. So a lot of the things that we're actually working with is asking the hard questions, asking why, when, how, who gets access to the data? Why are we doing that? Why are we storing this data? Why is this transferring? How can we make this more secure? Can we use this data for access control to tell the fire brigade where people are in the building so the evacuation is smoother and easier so we don't lose any lives? So trying to integrate the security of a cyber sphere with the analog sphere, if we can say like that. So, yeah. So we hope that some of the key points that you can get from this talk today is that there's an asynchronous relationship between decision maker and system user. So the people who are buying the system, paying for the system, is not necessarily the people who are using the system. So thinking about every time you're developing something or coding something, thinking about who is actually using this, because the people who are actually paying for something is not necessarily the people who will use it on a day-to-day basis. So trying to go a step further in to understanding the usability of something or an app or a service, and thinking, if I put this security measure in, would this make it harder for the user to actually use it and make it more insecure than it actually is supposed to be?
Yes, and the other part is that business owners or the decision makers sometimes have different views on what is actually secure compared to an employee. Because for an employee, something like using access control could be feeling very secure in their workspace, because then no intruders can get in here. But for a company owner, that could be very different. It could be something like, oh, okay, we need cybersecurity, or we need some gates here, and maybe that's just annoying for employees, saying, okay, weren't we secure enough with just this door? Why do we need this extra gate? Why do we need all of this extra stuff? It doesn't really make me feel more secure. Maybe it makes me feel more insecure, because maybe it makes me feel like there's a bigger threat, because why are we doing all of this if there's no reason for it?
Yeah, and people make decisions based on human factors such as belief, environment, experience, and so on. And again, mentioned people that gets the notification from the IT department, you have to make a new passcode every 3 months because you have to be safe, and no one understands why we have to do it. A lot of the people that we have interviewed in regarding to cybersecurity is that people don't really know why they have to change that passcode every 3 months. It's so annoying, and they have to spend 5 minutes every 3 months to make a new passcode, and usually people just do the same passcode and then just change one number, which means it's actually not helping, because that's not what they're supposed to do. So trying to make people understand why you have to be secure, but also thinking about, okay, where are they from? They spend 5 minutes every 3 months, and then when they have to log on to the computer, they have to lock the computer, have to log on, and then they have to log to another system, and then in the end they end up spending like 10 or 15 minutes each day just to get into the systems. That's a lot of downtime for production if you're a production company, and that worker or employee has to use that extra 15 minutes in the other end before they're going home to actually catch up to all the work they should have done in the 15 minutes in the morning, which means can we do something that's easy, secure, but also makes sense for both the employee and the employer?
Yeah, so another part here is that we're also talking about something like emergency situations where you may not be thinking clearly because there's an alarm blaring and everything is going, you don't really know how to act. So you'll just act on the way you normally do things. But that's the way that we hope that we can train people to actually follow policies, to know what to do once an alarm is blaring. So we're really hoping that we can actually look at these factors and say, okay, how do we make sure that people still know what to do?
Yeah.
So
that was all from us. We hope that you learned something and thought it was interesting. And if you want to connect or have any questions or want to work, we are looking for project partners in all of Europe because we work on different projects within cybersecurity development and software, both in EU projects and Danish projects. Please don't hesitate to contact us. We will very much like to talk to you.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. We have a couple of questions from the audience and we'll go through some of them. I'll start with the first one. What is the best way to avoid endless iterations with the user when designing a mock-up or prototype?
Yeah, it can be a bit of an issue, but I think a big part is actually trying to, you can use some co-creation. You can actually get the users to be a part of the product that you're actually trying to build. So have them draw something. And at the same time, we can try and get feedback from other users. Sometimes we use focus groups, where we have a whole group, where we try and get them to actually evaluate different features and get them to try and rank them, to try and figure out. But you can say that a product, especially a digital one, is always going to evolve a bit. So once we get some sort of decision saying, okay, there's a lot of people that actually want this and we're trying to build this, then we can try and make a prototype and make a bit more interaction into it. So for every iteration that we make, there's something different, and then we're testing out, and it'd be more and more advanced, hopefully.
Another question was, what do you think is the most important thing for us to take away as software developers, especially for IT security?
I think in regarding to, for example, cybersecurity, IT security is marrying or like balancing the GDPR, for example. There's a lot of rules about the data and where to save the data. So try to be thinking when you're doing development, not only think privacy by design, but also think ethics by design. Because a lot of the privacy that you can design or develop in an app or a service or so on, it's very good to have it as a design, but it's also good to think about the ethics about it. It's very good to have data. I'm not afraid of storing data, as long as think about what it can be used for. Because if it can be misused, do you really want to be the person who developed an app that saves data that can be misused in the future? I don't think anyone wants that on you. So to think about the ethics as well as the design, the privacy.
Yeah, and maybe also looking at if we can compare it to something like the construction industry, where they have a lot of safety regulations, and sometimes you will see some construction workers do some crazy stunts just because they have to follow policy, but they don't really want to because they don't understand why they should do it. So they will be standing in these crazy positions because they need to wear some sort of belt once they're up in the air, but they're actually doing something over here, and it's really a drag getting all the way down and then moving the wagon like 3 meters and then getting up there again. So maybe it's just easier to reach, and then it's not really that secure anymore. So it's a bit the same way that users are these construction workers that are trying to get work done the easiest way possible, and we're trying to make safety regulations for their sake, but we're making their work a lot harder, then maybe we should look at the safety regulations.
Another question was, can you recommend any semi-automated or automated user experience testing tools helping to find some of the most common UX problems in web apps? For example, button positioning, size, and so on.
Automation. I don't know if I know any kind of automated programs, but I use a lot of wireframing programs. For example, there's a few that you can use where you can actually use things that already exist, so you will just put in a footer and everything is already made for you and put in, so you can actually get a lot of inspiration of what's usual design. So that would be something called, I think it's called Mockflow, what I use. That's just a wireframing tool. It's pretty easy to use. But other than that, it might be a bit difficult for me to say because I'm a designer, so I want to use Photoshop and so on. Yeah, that might be, I don't know anything that's automated.
Do you have any tips on how to best filter customer feedback for its practicality during the prototyping phase?
Its practicality. Usually I would do, once you get feedback, it would be linked into different things because, for example, if I go and test a prototype that I have, I'm both interested in knowing the person that is giving me feedback and then the specific feedback that they're actually giving, and then trying to, we call it coded. It's actually where I just use a lot of Post-its and try to make these overarching kind of subject fields where I say, okay, so all of this has something to do with they really hated the color scheme. Okay, so maybe I could group in all of the comments that has something to do with that. Mm-hmm. So I would take a very low population. It could only be, it's only like 4 or 5 people that I test a design on. It's not really a lot of people. And then I kind of group all of their feedback into these different types of groupings to get an overarching view of, okay, so there's a lot of negative comments about this. Maybe I should look into this specifically and so on.
So grouping and consolidating, maybe. So next question, is it a good idea to use VR on a fire alarm?
Is it what?
Virtual reality. Is it a good idea to use virtual reality on a fire alarm was one of the questions.
We're not really using it on like fire alarms, we're using it as a training in relation to fire alarms. So for example, we are building the new Femern tunnel in Denmark that has to connect Denmark and Germany. The people who are building the tunnel, this is what this project is part of, will have to be in like a tube that will be underwater and at some time in the future, and we need to train them in fire emergency drilling in this kind of tunnel, but before the tunnel is built, so they have to know where to go when they're building the tunnel, and that's impossible because it doesn't exist yet. So we use VR to make this virtual reality as a real tunnel where they can test it and actually learn, okay, so if because the tunnel is already built in business interactive modeling, so they can actually go around like a game, like an interactive game, and then when they are building the tunnel, they will know exactly what to do if there's an emergency happening. So that's how we use it in relation to like fire alarms and fire alarm systems.
Such as for training and simulation purposes?
Yeah, it's training and simulation, yeah.
Yeah.
So one more question on, are you familiar with design sprints? So Jake Knapp's book, are you using this concept? What do you think of it?
We have used it a bit. Our only problem is that we aren't really, there isn't a lot of us. There's me, and then there's some programmers, and then there's a product owner and a project manager. So we try to work more agile, but our problem is that once we have sprints, I have to be, what can you say, way ahead of the programmers, because I have to test out, I have to interview people and figure out, okay, what we're actually making. Then I have to make a mock-up and test that. Then I have to make a real design and test that before we can actually start making anything for real. So I have to be way ahead of the people there, and that can actually be quite a bit of an issue. So we've tried working like that, but it's been a bit of a problem. So yeah, I think it goes a bit on and off, especially because a lot of us that are working on a lot of different projects, and yeah. So it can be a bit of an issue, but it is the end goal that we're going to work more in sprints in general, overarching in DBI.
Okay, so let's thank Sarah and Anja for their talk, for being here.